Okay, okay, it's recorded on the cloud. I will pick it up afterwards. Listen, I'm just thrilled that we have Peter Beinart here with us today. Peter, thank you so much for fitting us into your very crammed agenda. I do join Peter's Friday noon sessions where he brings in an amazing range of guests, and they're always very richly attended. And I'll send out to people afterwards a link, so if you're interested in joining up with that, you can. But Peter, I remember the first time I saw you, but the only time I've seen you in person was when you came to Ottawa about 6 or 7 years ago. I can't remember exactly. And you spoke at the, a liberal temple, synagogue, Reform synagogue here in Ottawa. You might remember it. And I was kind of shocked because all the Jews that I know in Ottawa tend to be kind of secular and not very religiously Jewish. And you were, to me, I found you a bit shocking because you were very demonstrably, I think you were wearing a kippah, and you were using in your presentation words that I didn't recognize, either Hebrew or Yiddish words that, and you were being very critical of Israel. And for me, that didn't compute somehow, because in my kind of very limited brain, the more, if you're an Orthodox Jew, then you must be very much in favor of anything that Israel does. And that was obviously wrong. And I found that fascinating. I've been following you ever since. And I think that you've made a terrific contribution to the evolving discussion, particularly among Jews, but not only among Jews in North America. So we're really thrilled to have you here with us for an hour or so today. So thanks, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Peter, I did circulate to people your bio, the Wikipedia bio, but maybe you could just start off by telling us a little bit about your personal evolution or your family evolution. You mentioned earlier in talking to Diana that you came from South Africa. How did you get from there to where you are now, kind of in a short form?
Sure, I'll try to do it quickly. I also, by the way, just to folks interested, I put the link to the newsletter that I write in the chat, and it's those conversations are part of the newsletter. My parents are South African. They emigrated to the United States just before I was born. The most Jewish communities, I would say this may be shocking. This is kind of surprising to many Jews in the United States, but actually I think the United States is one of the least Zionistic Jewish communities in the world. It's very Zionistic, but it's actually less Zionistic than most of the smaller diaspora communities around the world. And I think that the main reason for that is that is the pull of assimilation in the United States. Essentially, American Jews feel less fragile than smaller Jewish communities, so it's harder for American Jews to imagine needing Israel as a refuge. And the power of American nationalism, I think, also kind of supersedes, in a way, the power of Jewish Zionist nationalism. South Africa, by contrast, is more similar to Canada or to Australia. France or Britain. France, a little bit of a different dynamic because it's a majority Mizrahi population of North African Jews, but also extremely Zionistic. And so the South African Jewish community was an enormously Zionistic community in which essentially the dominant community's response to the moral dilemma of apartheid was essentially to say, we're just passing through here. It's not really our country. The most important book written about South African Jews was not called The Jews of South Africa, it was called The Jews in South Africa. And essentially what people did was they said, listen, the Afrikaners and Blacks are having a contest fight here. Our heart, as you know, as Yehuda Levi famously said, our heart is in the East. We're essentially the place that our moral connection, our emotional connection is to Israel. And that Zionist ethos heavily influenced my parents, particularly my mother. Although ironically, most South African Jews who left did not actually go to Israel. A lot of them went to Australia, which is an easier place to live than Israel. But still, the Zionist ethos was very powerful. It had a big impact on my parents. And particularly, I would say, with a particular twist, because although the South African Jewish community is overwhelmingly Lithuanian, and one could talk about the particular dynamics of that trajectory. My mother's family, my mother's mother was born in Egypt, and the family is from the Ottoman Empire. And so I think she had a particular sense of the fragility of diaspora Jewish existence, because she came from Alexandria, a Jewish community that had collapsed, then actually spent her teenage years in the Belgian Congo, of all places, in a Sephardi Jewish community in what's now Lubumbashi that collapsed, and then was in Cape Town, where the Jewish community was declining. So that Zionist ethos was very strong. And yet, over time, particularly in my teenage years, when the first Intifada broke out, the fact that my parents had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement led me to feel that there was a kind of a tension between this kind of very strong Jewish nationalism that I had grown up with and the kind of moral imperatives coming out of the anti-apartheid movement. And I think the experience of coming from a South African Jewish family, which is distinct than the experience that most other Jews have, given their experience, is that South African Jews were embraced as white. Again, a complicated and tenuous relationship, perhaps, in some ways, but still were embraced as white. So we're essentially exercising, we're in this privileged position in a situation of profound racism and oppression, and essentially accepted it for the most part, went along with it. I think the closest analogy would probably be Jews in the American South. That's not an experience that most Jews have in their family experience in the same way. They're much more attuned to think about Jewish history purely through the lens of Jews as victims. For me, I would say, while that I certainly understood that lens, I also had this experience of watching a Jewish community wrestle and generally fail the moral test of power. And so as I began to think about Israel more in terms of a moral test of Jewish power, because of interactions I had with Palestinians when I started to spend time in the West Bank, for instance, I began to see echoes of the ways in which good people and thoughtful people, people I love, could rationalize oppression very easily often. And I began to see a lot of echoes of the way that played itself out in the Israeli-Palestinian context, in the way it had in the South African context. And I would say, just to go to your last point, and I'll stop, one of the most profoundly challenging things to me in my entire life, as someone who strives to be a religiously observant Jew, is that, and would like to believe that there is a deep moral power in the Jewish religious tradition. Overwhelmingly, the South African Jews who met the moral test of apartheid the best were atheist communists. Whereas, just to give one particularly horrifying example, many South African Jews are now very proud that that all of the white defendants at the famous Rivonia trial, where Nelson Mandela was prosecuted, one of the main two trials, were all Jews. And yet what they like to focus on less, but those were all communist atheist Jews. The prosecutor, Percy Utar, was the president of the largest Orthodox synagogue in Johannesburg. And so for me, that's something that I wrestle with to this day.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Peter. I did circulate to people your essay from New York Times a year ago about why I no longer believe in a Jewish state. Peter, I want to ask just one clarification. Is it your position now that the idea of a Jewish state was wrong from the get-go, or was it a good idea and Israel's actions have made it now impossible? What's your feeling on that?
I would say, and I think my views have evolved, I would say at this point that the problem with the creation of a Jewish state was that it was not possible to create a Jewish state without having a Nakba, for pretty simple reasons. Because if you look, and this is something, again, that the kind of mainstream Jewish narrative about partition in 47, I think, never really grapples with. Given the demography, which was that 2/3 of the population in 1947 were Palestinian, only 1/3 was Jewish. and even in the Jewish state, the Jewish, the 55% that the UN gave to the Jewish state, you had an almost 50% Palestinian population, 40 or 50%, depending on it. So which essentially say, if you wanted a viable Jewish state, a state with a very large Jewish majority, which is clearly what Ben-Gurion and his associates wanted, you had to push Palestinians out of that state. There could be no viable Jewish state without the mass expulsion of Palestinians. And therefore, I think that's why, in retrospect, I would have supported the kind of the minority position at the UN in 47, the position that was argued for by Martin Buber and a small number of Jews who supported binationalism, which was to move towards a binational state, rather than the creation of a Jewish state in 1947, 1948.
Your views have evolved, as you said, over time. You were one of the leading Jewish spokespeople for a liberal Zionist two-state solution. What were the main steps that led you over time to change your mind? Was it you know, what were the 2 or 3 main things to say, okay, I got to recalibrate here? Or maybe they weren't 2 or 3, but.
Well, look, the most obvious is simply the fact that the two-state solution, if one is thinking about a viable sovereign Palestinian state, contiguous Palestinian state, is simply harder to imagine than it was 20 or 25 years ago, because Israel has entrenched its presence in the West Bank ever more profoundly. I mean, you can't even capture it simply by looking at the number of Jewish settlers, because it's not only a number, because it's an entire enterprise which involves the creation of massive infrastructure and the deep integration of that infrastructure into Israel. And, you know, ironically, this is one of the things that Palestinians have pointed out for many years. It was actually during the Oslo process that in many ways that some of those key moves took place, because you had the building of these bypass roads that meant that you could that really large Jewish settlements became essentially suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, because you could travel so much more quickly by bypassing Palestinian population centers across the Green Line. Now you have just, you know, things like, for instance, the, you know, creation of Israel's the newest medical school in the settlement of Ariel. In every Israeli cabinet, you have prominence. You know, Naftali Bennett was the head of the Yesha Council. He was the head of the Settler Council, and now he's the Prime Minister of Israel. So, you know, just to give, it is virtually impossible to find maps produced in Israel by any official Israeli body that show the Green Line. I happen to know this personally because my own kid's Jewish day school, one intrepid parent whose politics are like mine, there aren't very many, actually tried to get the school to find such maps, because the maps don't show the Green Line, and you really can't find them in Hebrew very easily at all. Anyway, so that was a big part of it. I think that I would say that. And I think the shift in Palestinian intellectual discourse, of course, you still have the PLO nominally supporting a two-state, but the shift in Palestinian intellectual discourse away from two states, I think has also had an impact on me. I think there was a time when it was easier to find Palestinian intellectuals and activists who were open to the idea of two states, than it is today, partly because of this shift. But also, of course, that discourse itself has forced me to ask questions that go beyond the question of the feasibility of the two-state solution to questions about the ethics of a solution which is designed which is designed to maintain a Jewish state, you know, a state in which Jews are politically dominant, because what that requires is, first of all, that Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are often called Arab Israelis in the Jewish conversation, have to remain second-class citizens, right? If the notion is the state has to privilege Jews, if it has to be based on Jewish supremacy, even if Palestinians are citizens, as they are in the Green Line, they have to be second-class citizens. Secondly, it means that you can't have Palestinian refugee return, because that would unsettle the demographic balance, which ultimately is what guarantees a Jewish state. And so I think I began to rethink the ethics of those two assumptions, which kind of underlie the two-state discourse, at least on the kind of Zionist side.
Just Peter, I'll just say to everybody, I'm going to ask a couple more questions of Peter, and then I will open up to questions from everybody else. So you can do so by raising your hand. But just let me pursue this a little bit with Peter for another 5 minutes or so, and then we can all get into the fray if that's okay. So Peter, what role did, you wrote a number of pieces about going to Israel, being caught with your kids at Ben Gurion Airport. I remember one essay about, I don't know, being in Hebron or someplace in the West Bank where there was settler violence and so on. Was the impact, the visceral impact, did that play an important role in your evolution? You presented it more as an intellectual kind of evolution rather than a gut feel kind of evolution.
Yeah, no, the visceral element was very, very important as well. I mean, it is, it's very different to know something intellectually than to see it and feel it viscerally. And that's why and this is where I may part company with some others on the left who are more sympathetic to anti-normalization. I think that actually I've seen the impact of interactions with Palestinians and listening to Palestinians on diaspora Jews, and I think potentially even Israeli Jews, can be really profound because it's hard to know really. It's hard to understand how deeply internalized a kind of racist assumptions may be until they're actually challenged by interpersonal interaction. So I think in my experience, most American Jews who I know who are on the center or the right genuinely do not feel themselves to have racist views about Palestinians. But if they encounter Palestinians, they are more likely to then realize that a whole set of assumptions that guide their discourse about in which it is this kind of faceless, nameless, menacing mass of proto-terrorists inclined towards Jew hatred, that actually is deeply racist. And once you encounter person after person after person whose life aspirations are no fundamentally different than your own, and who has been through horrible, horrible experiences of oppression, too many to simply discount as sui generis or kind of exceptional. You know, at a certain point, you are struck by both the profound pervasiveness of the human rights abuses that Palestinians experience, and also about the kind of the deep racism involved in suggesting that somehow they are to blame for that. And I think those two things in combination had a profound impact on me during my experiences with Palestinians in the West Bank and now just with Palestinian friends and colleagues in general.
What lessons do you draw about people changing their minds generally on this? Not from your trajectory, which is a combination of intellectual reflection, reading, and visiting. We are, all of us on this advisory committee, interested in trying to change Canadians' perceptions of understanding of the Israel-Palestine question, and we meet very entrenched views.
Yeah.
So what lessons do you draw from your own personal experience and from your experience in talking to American Jews?
I mean, I don't think there's one necessary answer. I mean, I think that if you look at situations where there is some kind of profound change, whether it's in South Africa or the United States during the civil rights movement, I think it's a combination of generally a combination of a kind of a moral appeal that can move people or move some people, and also pressure, right? I mean, it's never really the case that a group of people who enjoy privileges abandon them simply because they wake up and decide, you know, this is really not very nice, right? I mean, whether you look at the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, there has to be, as Frederick Douglass said, you know, power concedes nothing without a demand. So there has to be a kind of form of pressure in which people come to realize that the status quo isn't necessarily sustainable. But I think it's most powerful if that pressure is combined with a vision of an alternative in which people can situate themselves and imagine that in some ways that they can be okay, that even though the future is very different than what they expected it to be, that a white South African has a place in post-apartheid South Africa, that a white American has a place in post-Jim Crow, in the post-Jim Crow South, that a Jew has a place in an equal Israel-Palestine. And so I think that different people have different roles in that. And so I think of a lot of my work as speaking particularly to American Jews or Jews in general. And I think that I write in a particular way in order to try to think about how to respond to the arguments that are dominant in our community, and also to think about how to try to offer people a vision of Jewish identity, of Jewishness, that can exist and flourish absent Jewish statehood. And I would not expect Palestinians to do that work. And frankly, there are even many Jewish activists who are not particularly interested in doing that work, perhaps because they see themselves just in more universal terms. But for me, that work is very important for myself, as I think about as a father, for instance, and it's important for my own identity. So that's a way that I would say the niche that I try to work within in particular.
Why don't we turn it open to others? I know that some people would like to raise issues with you. Please raise your hand. We'll do it. Unmute yourself, Haig, and then the others, everybody else, will make sure you are muted, just so we don't have unnecessary background noise. Haig, go ahead. You're muted, Haig. Haig, you're muted.
There we are.
Okay, great.
Okay. Peter, thank you very much. I don't follow you as much as my Peter Larson does, but I read most of the things you write. And I have 2-3 questions, and I'll make them very brief, and your answers can also be brief to give a chance to the others. But Peter and I have a difference of opinion on what the future can be, 2-state versus 1-state. My problem is that I do not see the incentives for the Israelis to adopt the 1-state solution. Would you like to comment on that one? The situation for most of them is pretty good now. Why make it more difficult, less comfortable? That's one. The other 2 questions are, in 10 years roughly, what do you see Israel being like, and what do you have to say about the right of return of Palestinians? Thank you.
You're right that there is no current incentive for Israelis to support one equal state. I would say most Israeli Jews are quite comfortable with the one state that exists today, which is a one state in which Palestinians are either second-class citizens or non-citizens under Israeli control. But there's no incentive for Israel for Israeli Jews really to support a 2-state solution either. I mean, again, because the status quo is working. So I think, the question is, one needs to bring about a form of pressure that would make more Israeli Jews recognize that the status quo is not as comfortable and sustainable as it is today. And I think that, there are more effective and less effective ways to do that. But I think there has to be a pressure. Now, it might be that there, it may be that it seems like Israeli Jews would be more willing to accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza than they would be to accept one equal state overall. But I think there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, the 2-state solution, if it's a 2-state solution that is fundamentally premised on maintaining Jewish statehood, and this is ironically an argument that some on the Israeli right, like Netanyahu, have made, doesn't necessarily fundamentally solve some of the deeper problems, right? Because one of the things that I think Netanyahu actually realized was that the Palestinian movement would continue even after a two-state solution, because Palestinian citizens of Israel would not be content being second-class citizens, and because many Palestinians would still want a right to return to the places from which they were from. So the two-state solution might maybe seem more attainable, but it does not necessarily resolve some of the most fundamental and deepest issues. And I think that beyond that, there is a way in which that I believe the transformative moral power in terms of transforming global discourse and also even transforming potentially Israeli discourse is more powerful if focused on the idea of equality than in one liberal state than on the idea of ethno-nationalist partition, which I actually think is a much less powerful moral vision. It's not the moral vision. If you think about the great movements that I think have been able to make the impossible possible, right? I think they're built around the idea of freedom and equality, not ethno-nationalist partition. And I think that's why, in a fun way, even though the two states, one equal state may seem further away, the movement for it could ultimately be much more powerful. In terms of what Israel will be like in 10 years, you know, it's obviously always dangerous to just, you know, extrapolate from current trends, but clearly the current trends in Israel are moving Israel to the right, partly because of demography. While younger American Jews may be further to the left than their parents, in Israel, younger Israeli Jews are to the right of their parents. And that's because because while younger Americans are more secular, younger Israeli Jews are more religious. And there is a strong association with you know, modern and ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel are significantly further to the right than secular Jews, and those numbers are growing. And so I think that will likely push Israel continually to the right. I also think that I think it's likely that some point in the next 10 years we will have this period of relative quiet that we've had since the end of the Second Intifada in the West Bank, which has lasted from about 2005 until now. I think at some point will probably unravel. And I would imagine there will be new kinds of uprisings, intifadas that will emerge. I think it's quite possible that in that context, against the backdrop of an Israeli population that's moving further to the right, we will see more public, high-profile, serious calls for mass expulsion. I think one of the striking things I find about the Israel-Palestine discourse is that for most Jews who I talk to, the notion of a second Nakba, a second mass expulsion, of course, there's small level expulsions that continue all the time. The notion of another mass expulsion is very hard to imagine, just like it was very hard to imagine for many white American liberals to believe that the US would elect Donald Trump. It was not nearly as hard for Black Americans to imagine that America would elect Donald Trump, and they turned out to be right, nor is it nearly as difficult, in my experience, for Palestinians to imagine another act of mass expulsion. I think it's right. It is in Israel's political DNA, just like Donald Trump and white supremacy are in America's political DNA. And I think the polling already shows that you can get between 1/3 and 50% of Israeli Jews to basically say that would be a good idea, including some quite high-profile people, including prominent intellectuals. And so I think that idea, tragically, could very much come to the fore.
Thanks, Peter. I have 3 people who have raised their hands, Diana and Rick, and Mohammed has also sent me some questions to put to you. But Diana, you first.
Thanks so much, Peter. I so appreciate you. The main question, which is the purpose of this group, is I'd appreciate it if you could talk about the role of non-Jews in transforming the discourse on Israel-Palestine, and especially in undermining US and Canadian uncritical support of Israel, the government support.
I mean, I think that there has been always this appealing notion, you can see it in a group like J Street, for instance, that progressive Jews could be the kind of the white knights in this story, saving Israel, saving ourselves in some way. I think that while I think that's not a realistic vision, because ultimately Jews are not the group of people who have the most powerful incentive to change the status quo, even if you don't like this, even feel bad about it, right? the people with the most powerful incentive to change the status quo are Palestinians. They're the ones who are suffering. And so it seems to me, I think we're beginning to see this shift take place in the United States, that more and more this will be not a Palestinian only movement by any means, but in some ways a Palestinian led movement, or at least Palestinians will become much more prominent in it than they have historically, than they have been, because they've been very excluded often from the American political discourse and from the American media discourse. And so I think that what is interesting is to see think about the ways in which the Jews will participate in that broader discourse. I think in the United States, Black Americans will play a particularly important role, I suspect, in this, given their particular positionality in history. And so I think that this is not without its challenges and difficulties, even for quite progressive Jews. It is, even for many very progressive Jews, and I will say this sometimes for myself, it is not always easy to hear non-Jews, certainly those who you do not know, say certain things which are very harshly angry and critical, if you feel like they lack a certain kind of nuance or a certain kind of language of reassurance that you want, given Jewish anxieties that are there among many Jews, not all Jews, but most, about what the Jewish place in the world is and how Jews are perceived and truly perceived by non-Jews. That said, I very much profoundly believe in the idea that people are innocent of anti-Semitism until proven guilty, not proven guilty by the IHRA definition, but proven guilty by showing a kind of pattern of genuine animus towards Jews per se. And it also seems to me that there's this famous Maimonides was essentially challenged about the question of why he had learned astronomy and other things from the idolatrous Greeks. The Greeks were idolaters, nothing really worse in Jewish tradition than idolatry. And Maimonides famously outlined this principle in which he said, you should accept truth from whichever source it comes. And it seems to me that's a critical proposition for us to have. What matters is the truth of the statement, not the identity of the person making it. And I think under that principle, everyone should be welcome into a struggle for human rights.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for the question, Diana. So Rick, and then Mohammed, and then Robert. Rick.
Peter, like everyone else, I want to thank you for this opportunity to listen to you. I'm on your mailing list, and in preparation for today, I was thrilled to listen to the debate that you had with Alan Dershowitz a few years ago at New York University. And what I inferred from that exchange was that here we have two, it's a little bit like the Wimbledon finals, two of the finest on the planet, debating such complexities. The words that, just about every word that you exchanged with Mr. Dershowitz was open to interpretation. Jewish values, a Jewish state, what is Judaism? And Dershowitz invoked animal sacrifice, for instance. You pointed to a lack of counteroffers when describing when offers had been made, and you described the concept of reparations. It seems to me that what impressed me so much from this debate is that both of you in the middle of these complexities were so confident and so comfortable in your own points of view. And what I took from Alan Dershowitz was his celebration of sort of excellence in Socratic rhetoric, whereas you, I saw coming from the perspective of someone who had a pragmatic, rich grasp of definition of universal human rights and the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law. My question is one that you've probably heard over and over again. It's not new, but it would be new to us to hear your current evolved definition. Do you envisage sometime in the future the emergence of a safe and mutually respectful relationship between the two opposing participants? If so, no matter how long it might take, of all the options available, which model, in your view, Peter, has the greatest prospect of success?
My view on this has evolved. I would now argue, and I made this argument in 2 essays over the last couple of years in Jewish Currents, both of which were excerpted in shorter form in the New York Times. One arguing for one equal state, the second argument for refugee return, or the right of refugee return. That I think that a model of full equality, that doesn't mean that there can't be autonomy for different communities, that, Israeli Jews will want to run their schools in Hebrew, most of them. Palestinians will want to have their schools in Arabic. There can be autonomy in a federal system. And you can even think about political arrangements and, that give certain guarantees to minority communities that they can't be kind of run roughshod over. We see ways in which this operates in Belgium, for instance, or Northern Ireland, maybe even in Quebec in certain ways. But that I think ultimately that reconciliation, a true reconciliation, has to come through with full equality and with some effort at historical justice. Now, that effort at historical justice may never be full. It may never be possible to have complete historical justice. But I think certainly one of the lessons that we see from Black American writers in the United States is the way in which forgiveness requires some act of concrete, symbolic and concrete amends. And I wrote in my newsletter this week, actually, in a perhaps more abstract and kind of theological vein, looking at the book of Exodus and the particular Torah portion, Parshat Bo, that many Jews read in synagogue on Saturday, looking at the critical element of restitution, of compensation for the Israelites when they were leaving slavery in Egypt. That's actually that's a critical element in the story of the Exodus story, that the Jews don't leave, the Israelites do not leave empty-handed, and that in fact, according to some commentaries, it is the fact that they receive that compensation that allows them to forgive Egyptians. In fact, there's Moses says in the book of Deuteronomy, you may not hate an Egyptian, right? And there's a linkage between that. And so it seems to me, if Jews want Palestinians to forgive and begin anew, given the immense trauma of what political Zionism has meant for Palestinians, that it is not realistic or fair to expect Palestinians to settle for less than equality and to settle for less than a genuine effort at historical justice. Now, what that means in practice is complicated. I tried in my essay, Tshuva, which is about refugee return, to look at some of the work that's been done on the question of refugee return and what it might look like in practice. But that would be my view in the long term about what's most sustainable. I mean, I think I'll end on this note. In South Africa, again, the place my family is from, even though South Africa has achieved enormous amounts, what you clearly see now in South Africa is that one of the greatest threats, maybe the greatest threat, to South Africa's democratic stability and multiracial reconciliation is the lack of concrete concrete movement in terms of land and economic distribution of wealth that would provide us a form of historical justice for Black South Africans. That is a kind of unexploded bomb underneath the post-apartheid experience. And just as in a certain way, the lack of reparations for Black Americans represents that in the United States. Obviously, I know Canada has had its own enormously painful issue with the question of Indigenous Canadians, and to your credit, are far ahead, whatever your failings, far ahead of where we are in the United States in terms of addressing that. But I think that represents another threat to ultimately in the U.S. if we don't begin to start to grapple with historical justice in that context.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for that great question. And that actually leads to Mohammed, your turn to a Palestinian refugee. You've got your turn to ask Peter questions.
Hello, Peter. It's been a pleasure listening to you. I guess my main question, Rick has asked it and you pretty well answered it. I have another angle on the same question. You talk about applying pressure against Israel. What form of pressure are you recognizing? Because the Palestinian has constantly tried to apply pressure, and it has by far ignored by international community. And one of the points I always debate with Peter Larson about this idea of the Palestinian offering assurances to Jews. And I look at it and I tell him, we're the Palestinian who are under the gun, and we're supposed to provide safety for the person who's holding the gun again on our heads.
Yes.
So when you
Yes.
talk about the analogy of pressure,
Yes.
I guess we went from the Intifada to the BDS to Hamas rockets,
Yes. Yes.
and nothing had worked so far. I'd like to listen to more about that point. Thank you.
Yes. I just want to echo the point that you made, which I think is so important, which is to say, any dominant group, privileged group, has this terror of things being turned on their heads, right? I mean, if you look at US discourse in the South during slavery and segregation, you see this common, so absurd, but common trope that if whites are not on top dominating blacks, blacks will be on top dominating whites, right? There is always this terror. It was true for most white South Africans believed that if there was a multiracial democratic government, their lives would be in danger. Overwhelmingly, that's what white South Africans believe, according to polls. So that's true for any dominant privileged population. When you add in the history of Jewish trauma, right, and the fact that Jews did experience an attempted genocide, it's even more so. So there is this profound desire for reassurance. But I think your point is very important, which is that people who are on their knees cannot provide that reassurance. Because even if they provide it, the response will be, well, sure, but you're on your knees. What happens when you're no longer on your knees? What happens when you're not shackled? How can we believe that you will still feel that way? There is no binding, and you know, Mandela recognized this in a very profound way. You know, Mandela is considered now to be the great master of reconciliation, but he was an extreme hardliner on the question of the sequencing of that reconciliation. So for instance, when the South African government came to him repeatedly when he was in jail and said, essentially, we want to let you out of jail. They really did at this point. Just reject violence, reject armed struggle. Because, you know, Mandela had been one of the people who turned the African National Congress from nonviolence to violence, to the armed struggle. Mandela said, I will not reject armed struggle until we have a date for a free election. Then, once that shift had taken place, he did these extraordinary acts of reassurance. Literally, he went to visit the widow of Hendrik Vervoort, the prime minister who had instituted many of the most vicious anti-apartheid laws, and had tea with her. So I think that question of sequencing is critical. Now, it's not my place to map out what the Palestinian strategy or struggles are. I just don't have the knowledge base to really understand the dynamics at play. It's too opaque to me, and it's not my role. I would say that when I think about the Palestinian struggle in comparison to the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, a couple of important differences, there are a couple of important striking differences. The first is the Palestinian Authority decided to enter into a collaborationist project with the Israeli government, particularly after the Second Intifada, supposedly on the logic that if they reassured Israel by working with the Israeli military to prevent attacks on Israelis, that would reassure Israel, and therefore Israel would be willing to create a Palestinian state. That's exactly the opposite of what the African National Congress and its local allies, the United Democratic Front, did in the 1980s, where essentially what they said was, we are going to do everything possible to raise the cost of your control over Black populations by making the townships ungovernable, right? So while the Palestinian Authority subcontracting has led the cost of Israeli control over the West Bank to go way down, because Israel doesn't have to pick up the garbage anymore. It has the PA to do its dirty work in a whole series of ways. The ANC did exactly the opposite. The costs for Black South Africans were enormous. of that strategy in the 80s. But the costs for the white South African government were also very high, which did help to provoke the rethinking within the business and Afrikaner governmental elites that ultimately helped to bring about the transition. So I think that's one important thing to shift. The other thing is that when I know the BDS movement is built on a kind of an analogy with the anti-apartheid movement, but there is a critical difference, which is when the anti-apartheid movement was trying to build a global movement to put pressure, it was doing so in partnership with a political movement, with a political party, with the ANC, that very consciously moved to make Mandela, who no one had seen for decades, into a political symbol. The BDS movement is trying to do with that, but it doesn't have the other it has the civil society element, but it doesn't have a political partner that in the way that the anti-apartheid movement had in the ANC. It has essentially it has Hamas, which doesn't have any global appeal as an Islamist movement, it not offering a compelling moral vision, and it has a collaborationist and corrupt Palestinian Authority. So I question how much success the civil society BDS movement can have without having without the PLO playing the kind of role that the ANC was playing in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. You needed both. Now, I don't know how that transition could take place, but it seems to me that those would be the kinds of shifts that would make Palestinian pressure on Israel more formidable.
Robert. You have to unmute yourself, Robert. Robert, you're still muted.
There. Hello. Peter, first, I'd like to thank you very, very much for not just today, but for a whole body of work going back, I guess now 20 years or so, and your current editorship of Jewish Currents, which I believe is a remarkable magazine, and all your writing. All of that to really, in a way, also state how so many, Jews of goodwill, such as yourself and Diana and hundreds and thousands of others with IJV and with Independent Jewish Voices here in Canada. You start in a place of anti-occupation, and the pure logic of that eventually brings you to anti-Zionism, where you recognize the fundamental bankruptcy of the various pillars that uphold Zionism. And then the question is, where do you go with that logic, which has brought you personally and others? But there's a tremendous resistance in so many fashions, whether it's the institutions or media or the synagogues and so on, to bring people along to that eventual kind of recognition and realization that you got to wake up and move. And so I can only see the deep frustration for people such as yourself and Diana, who in a way have seen the light, and not in a kind of a glorious religious experience, but just out of pure goodwill and reading and observation. So how do you deal with that frustration, and how do you bring people along? I know you try so hard, but I just don't know how it can be done. And I also feel that in your last piece that you had mentioned about, the Exodus piece of giving retribution or compensation for past wrongs, it seems to me that bringing in religion, the Jewish religion, for whether out of its tribalism or its universalism, just doesn't work. And Anyway, I think I may have muddied the water a little bit here in terms of the religion part, but you know where I'm getting at, I think. Thank you.
Yeah. So first I should say this may surprise and maybe disappoint some folks, but I actually don't identify myself as an anti-Zionist. I would identify myself as a cultural Zionist.
Right, that's fine.
Just to explain that distinction, there are many on both the right and the left who might find that kind of a meaning, an insignificant distinction on the theory, which is not crazy, that Zionism is in reality the ideology of this state. So whatever the state does is Zionism, in fact. But to me, the reason that I find the cultural Zionist, non-state Zionist tradition, which goes back to Achad Ha'am and then people like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus appealing, is that it emphasizes the importance of a Jewish society in Israel-Palestine. And to me, a flourishing Jewish society in Israel-Palestine is very important, because I do think that there are things that are possible in a Jewish society that exists in Israel-Palestine that are different than what is possible in terms of Jewish life in the diaspora, in states that are where Jews are a very small minority. Not to say that Jewish life in Canada and the United States isn't wonderful in its own way, but fundamentally different in terms of cultural production. Because I also think it's important for me to say I'm a cultural Zionist, because I believe, and this is actually something where I would disagree with Omar Barghouti, for instance. He does not imagine this as being a binational state. In his vision, Palestinian identity is broad and capacious enough to essentially encompass Jewish identity. There were Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims. That's not the way I see it. To me, I believe this would be an equal binational state in which there would be a Jewish national identity. It would simply be within a framework of legal equality without Jewish privilege over Palestinians. I don't know what ultimately works well in the long term in terms of changing people's minds. I mean, I think that I will say again that I don't think these things are linear. I think that what one sees in other movements is that there are for whatever reasons, there are certain breakthroughs. There are moments when there is a kind of tipping point for whatever set of reasons, and it's often extremely difficult. I mean, who saw the Arab Spring coming, right? Who saw the fall of the Soviet Union coming? You know, very few people tend to see these things coming, really. You know, so I don't know if we are 1 year away or 10 years away, or maybe never. I mean, I don't want to fall into this liberal progressive trap of thinking that history always has a progressive arc. It doesn't. So I don't know. In some ways, it's beyond. I can't really afford to worry about that too much. I think that, but I will say that as someone who is a critic and an opponent of the organized Jewish political establishment in the United States, but also someone who has a fair number of relationships with people in it, close relationships going back a long time, it sometimes seems more imposing on the outside than it does from the inside, or another way of saying is, in my experience, I can't speak for Canada, but there are more people inside of that citadel who have more genuine, real qualms and sleepless nights than it might appear from the outside. And I think, frankly, sadly, there's a lot of careerism in which people kind of go along with things because it's the path of least resistance. And I think that groups like Encounter in the United States, which have now taken a lot of prominent Jewish leaders, rabbis and others, to the West Bank, those are shattering experiences for people. They're not necessarily experiences that people can act on right now because they are too hemmed in by the locus of their lives and their professional relationships. But there are cracks there that are not visible from the outside. And I think about that as potentially something that could be important. I think that in terms of, look, I use a religious language sometimes because it's an authentic expression of who I am, not because I necessarily think that and certainly not because I think it's the only way to speak. I think it can be valuable in certain Jewish spaces, particularly given that it is the more religiously observant Jewish communities that tend to be further to the right, that are the most powerful bloc supporting a kind of unconditional support for Israel, and that I do think it's very important for us to try to make some inroads inside the Orthodox community, because in the generation to come in the United States, certainly, it will be the Orthodox community that is the foundation, the underpinning of American, of the pro-Israel establishment, because the secular Jews who tend to be the mainstay, their children are generally not nearly as interested. But you have a huge number of younger American Orthodox Jews. You think of someone like Jared Kushner or Ben Shapiro. That's a template that will be replicated on a large scale inside the American Jewish community, and I would imagine in Canada as well. And it's important to be able to speak to those people in their language and have them be able to find a touchstone for the discourse that they have, which is also a discourse that I'm comfortable with. But I understand it's not for everybody, and so people should take it or leave it.
There's a couple of people who haven't spoken yet. David Holt, I see you raise your hand. I'd like to get a couple of women on, so start thinking. But David, up to you. You're muted still, David.
Thanks again, Peter. Wonderful insights. You've alluded a number of times to the lack of any real pressure from the international community on a pressure to transform Israeli public opinion in terms of the future of Israel-Palestine. It seems to me that a key reason for that lack of pressure is what I see as an absolutely stunning silence of the media, particularly in the US and particularly in Canada, about what's actually going on in the West Bank. I read the English edition of Haaretz every day. It seems like a terrific newspaper. And almost every day there's some egregious example of human rights violations going on in the West Bank. You hear virtually nothing of it. Even in the sort of standard bearers of what you think is good journalism, New York Times, Washington Post, the Globe and Mail here, it's almost total silence about what's going on. And I'd like your comment on that, and whether you feel it could change in the future, or whether we're stuck in that impasse.
Sure, I'm actually going to put in the chat. I wrote I wrote about this a week or so ago, or 10 days ago, a little bit. I can't speak to Canada, but I think in the U.S. actually there is a shift that's taking place. I think you saw it during the last spring's violence. I think that it is for a variety of reasons that I try to get into in this piece. I think that although Palestinians are still relatively marginalized in the U.S. discourse, there has been progress in terms of Palestinian voices, which is the single most critical, I think, way of changing this discourse. That historically the bounds of legitimate discourse in the American media have really been bounded by political Zionism. So you've had it's Bret Stephens on the one hand and me, or it's Jeremy Ben-Ami against Bret Stephens or something like this. And Palestinians are kind of left out. I think that is shifting a bit, and I think a big part of the reason it's shifting in the United States is the Black Lives Matter movement, and to some degree perhaps Me Too as well, made people in the media more embarrassed than they had been in the past about this tendency to speak about historically marginalized groups without actually having them on stage. And I think it's much rarer on, I'm not talking about Fox News on the right, that's different. But if one's talking about CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, when you're having discussions about race in the United States, it's less common to have conversations about race that don't include Black voices, and less common to have conversations about gender that don't include women. And I think by extrapolation, it did start to dawn on people that there was a problem with having conversations about Palestinians so often that did not include Palestinians. And so I think that we are starting to see that shift to some degree. Now, there are still, I think it still has a long way to go. And there's a strong pushback, which is to say, if your fundamental argument is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, then you can't really allow Palestinians to participate in this discourse, because Palestinians are kind of almost by definition anti-Semites, because they're almost certainly going to be anti-Zionist. So there is this pushback, but I think that nonetheless, we're seeing a potentially important shift. If I had to say, I actually have a fair amount of optimism about the trajectory of the public media, cultural discourse in the US. Where I'm much more pessimistic is about the ability of that discourse to translate into American policy because of how insulated our political system is from public opinion and public pressure in so many ways. And in some ways, our political system is becoming more insulated.
Peggy, I see you raising your hand. I can feel you raising your hand. And then Joe Debonay after you, right? Okay.
Okay, well, I guess I'd pick up on the last point that Peter made. I mean, I had written down the question, what about American, the costs of occupation are currently underwritten by the United States, and is there any sign that might change? Now, your comment that suggests not anytime soon, but anyway, just if you wanted to say more on that.
I mean, I think to me, the question, in an interesting way, I would say a democratic future for Israel, Palestine, and a democratic future for the United States are intertwined. As you know, watching this from north of the border, that democratic future in the United States is very much up in the air. If the Democratic Party were to be able to take power and wield power, given its shifting demographic base of Black Americans, other people of color, younger, more left-leaning, and generally more secular Americans, you could see an American president who might try to rethink the U.S.-Israel relationship. If Bernie Sanders had been the president and we had some kind of uprising in the West Bank, he would probably not have given Israel a kind of carte blanche. He might have even said to Israel at a certain point, listen, we're not resupplying you with weapons so you can shoot these protesters, now Sanders is the most progressive member of the US Senate on this. So even he's a bit of an outlier in the Democratic Party, but it's possible, it's certainly possible to imagine the Democratic Party moving in that direction. To me, the bigger question is, can the Democratic Party take power, given that we have a system that always had these strong anti-democratic features that are now being kind of weaponized in unprecedented ways in order to maintain a kind of white Christian political hegemony. And I had a quite fascinating, and I will say dispiriting, conversation with someone I talk to fairly frequently, who spent many, many decades within the American Jewish organizational establishment. And what he said was what I had kind of feared, but and also imagined, which is that he said that from inside groups like AIPAC, the analysis of American politics is that Republicans will be in power for a long time, since AIPAC has to have an analysis of American politics in terms to figure out how it's going to behave. And I think that to some degree, it's possible the American Jewish establishment comes to understand that, notwithstanding its rhetoric about American democracy, that its pro-Israel policies that it wants to maintain can actually only be maintained if the Trump Republican effort is successful in order to turn the United States in an increasingly authoritarian, anti-democratic direction.
Thank you for that optimistic scenario, Peter. Joe Debonay. Make sure you unmute there, Joseph. Dr. Debonay. There we go.
Peter, it was such a pleasure to listen to you. You're such a deep thinker and you're so articulate expressing your thoughts. Now, I'm going to try and get you to change hats and be a decision maker. I'll start my question by saying that I'm glad that you were born in the United States. If you were president of the United States and your party, the Democratic Party, controlled both the Senate and Congress, what would you do with the Israeli-Palestinian question?
I think I would, well, look, the political challenge for any US president, even, and it would be true for Bernie Sanders, right, is that you have many issues to focus on. And this is an issue that you know is going to produce immense political resistance, right? And yet it's not necessarily clear what the political benefit is, right? I mean, it's not as if, you know, if you want to win votes, you know, you try to give Americans better healthcare. You try to, you know, you try to build infrastructure. You do things that have tangible benefits. There's not a tangible benefit for Americans. There are some Americans for whom this is a moral imperative, but it's not something on which most people are voting. And of course, the political pressures on the other side are very, very intense. So that's why I think, you know, most Americans, certainly Joe Biden, I think, you know, never had any aptitude, willingness to have any political conflict over this issue. Even Barack Obama, I think, actually, by my reading is that by 2010, Barack Obama had thrown in the towel and kind of wanted not very much more to do with this. On Iran, he was willing to fight because that was an issue. But on the Palestinian question, he was trying to get out of it, really. That said, if I were kind of had a free hand to do what I want, I would essentially put US military aid on the table. And I would basically say to Israel, the US is not going to give unconditional military aid, and it's not going to give unconditional diplomatic support to protect you in the International Criminal Court and the UN. And I think that that would have a quite profound impact inside Israel politically. Of course, such a president would become very unpopular in Israel, but I think it would undermine the Israeli right in very important ways. If you look at Benjamin Netanyahu's political success over the 10 years, one of the reasons that I think he was so politically successful is that his centrist opponents like Tzipi Livni and Ehud Barak they didn't use a moral language, but they tended to say, listen, your policies of just killing the two-state solution are going to lead us to be isolated internationally, and they're going to impair our relationship with the United States. And Netanyahu was able to say, no, they're not. We can have our cake and eat it too. And he was right. Israel has been able to have its cake and eat it too. I think that because the US was never willing to put anything on the table in terms of tangible pressure, Israeli Jews were never forced to choose. And I think if they're forced to choose, then I think it does change the political debate in Israel. I don't think that alone would be enough to change things. Again, I think Palestinian resistance, Palestinian pressure, Palestinian vision is crucial. But I think that a shifting US policy could play a role. Because I assume that if the US opened the door, that Canada and European countries would, maybe not the Eastern European countries, but the Western European and Canadian countries would follow, right? Because they're already more inclined to do it than the US is. It's just that I think that they have a lot of difficulty acting without the United States.
I think we're going to have to wind things up there now. Hope everybody felt they had a chance to ask a question. Peter, I think this has been remarkable. I can't help but say I agree with Joseph and others saying we can't help but be impressed by the depth and the thoughtfulness of your reflections, the wealth of experience. I remind people, and I will include a link to his Friday noon seminars, in which not only does Peter talk, but he brings an amazing range of guests, some of which he agrees with and some he disagrees with. And perhaps when he's got guests that he doesn't agree with, it makes it more interesting conversation. But on behalf of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, Peter, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us, and good luck to you and good luck to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.